Well, hello, and welcome to Beyond the Sermon, a Bethany podcast where we have the privilege of digging deeper into our Sunday messages. I am Tami DeLau, and today, as always, I am joined with Pastor David Baxley and Pastor Steve Musto.
What, like as usual?
Yeah. Okay, as usual. Okay,
yeah,
that's true. Almost always. Okay, yes. All right. You're right. So last week, it was wonderful because we got to look at the historical significance behind why we baptized.
Yeah.
That was so good.
It was fun for me. It was really fun for me because I don't get a chance to do that very often. Yeah. So,
and it's fun, enjoyable. You know, even coming out of that and worshiping and doing the baptisms, it just felt so unified in a way. You don't always get to do it that way. Right. And it's just such a sweet Sunday.
And what I thought was cool is I know a lot of the people that were baptized had family members that came because they love their child and their child is doing something significant, but probably did not know what their child was doing. So how cool that we got to explain that. Awesome. And I've been walking with the Lord since 11, and I learned something new. So that was cool. So this week, we're going to kind of do the same thing with communion.
Yes.
So guys, ready to dive in? Okay, let's do it. Okay, guys, so I know this is kind of the part of our podcast where if we have questions about the message from last week. So this whole animal sacrifice, thinking of the culture that we live in and the sad dogs on the, TV and save the dogs. And
I will remember you.
So animal sacrifice, like it seems cruel. So let's kind of go there a little bit. So.
Yeah, animal sacrifice. Wow. So, it's a little less cruel when we think about, most of us eat meat. Mm-hmm. And so we just don't know the source of our meat. We don't get to meet our meat before we eat.
Before we eat the meat.
So that's part of our world here. Yeah, animal sacrifice was a stand-in. It's important to know a couple things. One is that it was not, God didn't invent it in the sense that he gave it to the Jewish people and said, guys, I found something that will kind of be a placeholder for Jesus forgiving your sins someday. It was already being widely practiced in the world. It was a thing. It had become a thing. And I'm not entirely sure where we have all the way back to Genesis.
I was about to say we see it there.
We have Cain and Abel, right? Mm-hmm. So Abel and sacrifices something that is pleasing to God. So there's a sacrifice there. God institutes the first, if we could call it a sacrifice, by killing his own creation to clothe Adam and Eve. So the idea of death and of dying and animals dying goes back really to the beginning. But this idea that we do this to appease God or to forgive sins or to tell God, thank you, that sort of develops over time. It can be a troubling thought for those who are more inclined to compassion. So I guess the question is why? Why is it necessary? Why can't God just say, you know what?
Like ollie income free.
Yeah, it's not that big a deal. Just go ahead. So let's talk about that.
One of the things that I often reflect on, and it's an answer that works for me. I acknowledge this may not work for everyone, is I start with a premise: God makes rules. And there's things that don't make sense to me. And God has established, in a sense, in the same way we see kind of the laws of physics, supernatural laws, to which he has said, this is how we're going about do this. This is my design. And I recognize as the creator of animals, humans, all of this, he's saying, I've created this for this purpose. And sometimes I think we get in the way of God, saying, God, that's not the right way you should use your creation.
Right.
So I recognize that's not always a great answer for everyone, but when I get confronted or feel these why, I will go there, because sometimes even the right answer doesn't appease the struggle.
Right. Now, God is holy. Mm-hmm. So several weeks ago, I used a very provocative, detailed illustration about God's holiness. And I said, for us, if we go in to use the bathroom and we see something sitting on the toilet seat, we can't just overlook it.
Sure. Yep.
And so what we ask God to do in his holiness and his perfection is, God, just overlook. It's not that big a deal. Whatever we did is not a big deal.
Yeah.
It can't be overlooked. Part of God's nature, part of his character is that there are things that God cannot do. God cannot do something that is fundamentally against his character or his nature. God cannot sin. God cannot be a party to sin. God cannot overlook sin at just part of his holiness. It's not possible for him to do. And so that's not even on the table. So something has to pay for sin. And in God's grace, it ends up being, he allows for this, the illustration I used this past week was the charge card.
That was such a good illustration.
Yeah, the charge card of I paid for it. Well, you didn't really.
Right.
You didn't pay for it. It's just now somebody else is owed. Mm-hmm. And that was part of the thought. I don't know how well everybody in Old Testament days really understood that. But if reading back into Scripture now, we see all along that's what God was saying. And even through the prophets, he was saying, this is being put off, this is being put off, this is being put off, and one day it's going to be paid for.
And along with that narrative, we see not only the narrative of all the way back to the garden, the consequence of sin is death.
Right.
He warns that from the very beginning. So we are living, if it feels yucky, to quote a Tami word, if it feels yucky.
You love it when I use that word.
I do.
Not.
It's because it is. It's a result of sin.
Yeah.
And so that has not been rectified yet. It's not. And so even the yuckiness of that. Yeah. It's because death entered the world because of our sin. And now God comes back also with that theme of blood being how life ultimately comes back into place, the way God designed it to.
So, yes, God can't overlook it, but is there a mercy and a grace in doing it? I can't imagine being there, having this animal and watching it die, to realize that this is what sin is. I am so, as much as I'm thankful we are not part of the sacrificial system anymore, I wonder if it helped man to see their own depravity and their need for something else.
It helped King David, to see his need. Mm-hmm. Remember the story that the prophet tells to him and says it tells the story of a shepherd.
Yeah.
David's a shepherd.
Yeah.
And so he comes in and he tells him a story about sheep and about one man and one sheep that this sheep is not like the sheep you raise in the field. It's more like a pet. And David's shepherd heart gets pulled into the story. Mm-hmm. And the punchline of "you are the man" is so powerful that David is immediately convicted of his sin.
So God is pulling his people into the story to see their sin. Okay.
So people saw animals certainly as more like property and that kind of thing, and much the way farmers today see it. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have the capacity to see them also with compassion. Mm-hmm. David certainly did.
Good.
So I know this week, part of what we're going to talk about is, well, first of all, a week from today, we will not be sitting here because it is Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And it's a feast that we get to do with the people that we love. So we know that Israel had their own holidays, and all of them had an element of Thanksgiving to them.
Yeah.
So let's connect their Thanksgiving with ours a little bit.
Right. So the holiday that first, well, they have a holiday that's like a harvest kind of festival. So if you remember the story in Exodus, Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, the first ask is, let my people go out into the desert to sacrifice. Well, what is that? That's like some sort of harvest festival that has come up. It's a thanksgiving to God for the harvest. And it's not that God institutes it and puts things in place. It's just done. It's part of their tradition. It's part of their practice. And this is what they're fighting over. The Pharaoh was saying, no, you can't do that because I don't trust you. And the people are saying, but we this is what we do. We go and we haven't been able to practice this for a long time, and we want to do this. And so that's some of where the battle is. When God institutes Passover, it takes the place of this kind of harvest festival, or they kind of get combined together in some ways.
Okay.
So the people are in slavery in Egypt, and there have been 9 plagues. Mm-hmm. It's been cracking the Egyptians' resolve, but Pharaoh makes one last stand. Okay. And each of those plagues is against one of the gods of Egypt, and this last one is against really against Pharaoh himself, who was considered a god in Egypt. He would have been worshipped and revered.
And that last plague was going to be the death of all firstborns.
Firstborn.
Not only human firstborns, but the firstborn of animals
Yep.
also. And so for the Israelite people to be spared that plague,
Yes.
they needed to kill a lamb or a goat that was a year old, a spotless lamb. They needed to take a hyssop branch, and I'm not sure how they did it, but do the lintel and the doorposts.
Correct.
And as the angel of death or destruction was passing, it would pass over that home. So the
Yes.
firstborn in that home would live.
Yeah, there's a lot of symbolism going on. There's shed blood.
Yep.
There is
Which we learned is a purifier last week.
That's right. Yeah, there you go. See, you're listening.
I was listening.
Yeah. Sometimes you're sleeping back there, and I'm just not sure.
There you go.
And then you enter the house, and you enter under the blood.
Yeah. Covered.
Yeah, you're covered.
Yeah.
And don't leave the door.
And don't leave it closed. And then as long as that mark is on, as long as you are covered on the blood, everybody in that house is okay.
Right.
And so there's a lot of symbolism.
So
going
not
on.
only doing that, but then they had to eat. They ate that lamb, and in haste. There's just so much. We could talk for hours.
Yeah.
So let me jump into the scripture, part of the passage that you're going to use.
Yeah.
So you will be in Exodus 12, and when I host this week, I'm going to tell them to go to the right passage. I'm going to work really hard on that.
She was saying Leviticus last week.
As opposed to Exodus.
And I was like, oh no, I don't know what's in Leviticus chapter.
So this
19.
week,
Well, you have to do whatever Tammy says, and we
It's
expect
like-
you to from this point on.
Simon says. So, on your marks, go. So you will be in Exodus 12, 1 through 16, but I am going to start in verse 12 right now. And so we hear, I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night and strike every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both people and animals. I am Yahweh. I will execute judgments against all the gods of Egypt. The blood on the houses where you are staying will be a distinguishing mark for you. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will be among you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day is to be a memorial for you, and you must celebrate it as a festival to Yahweh. You are to celebrate it throughout your generations as a permanent statute. So this was told to them before the act even happened, correct?
Yeah. So a couple marks, a couple interesting parts of this. This becomes New Year. So the Passover, basically the calendar doesn't change in the sense that God wipes it out. They're still they're still following a calendar that they always have, but this becomes the new year. So now this Passover is going to become the new year. It'd be like someone coming to us and saying January 1st is not going to be the new year anymore. From now on, it's going to be September 1st. Okay. September 1st is the new year. So that's happening. And to some degree, they had already been doing this because, again, the harvest kind of marks the beginning of either however you think about it.
The beginning or the end.
The beginning or the end of that year. So they're right around that time. But God is saying, no, this is going to be the pinnacle of the kind of the holiday feast, festival, celebration. This is going to be the thing that marks your year from now on, is this thing called Passover. And because part of what he tells them to eat is also unleavened bread without yeast, the Passover, the night of Passover, is a one-night feast, but the festival of unleavened bread is like a week-long feast. And those two things over time just get combined
morphed
together. And so they're more separated out when you read Exodus 12, but they become, enmeshed later on.
So we understand the lamb and the blood because of Passover. Unleavened bread. Mm-hmm. What is the significance of that they're told to use unleavened bread?
Speed.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a couple things about it. One is that God loves symbolism. So the symbolic nature of you don't even have time. Something is about to happen. Mm-hmm. You guys don't even have time to wait
For your bread to rise.
For the bread to rise. You don't have time because it's about to, you got to be ready. And so that's why they're to do that. They're to eat it wearing their travel clothes. So that's part of it. The other part of it, this is what I found interesting about this, is that yeast is, they're not only not allowed to have yeast in the bread, it's not allowed in their homes. And
like you can't hide it in the back of the cupboard.
Right. You can't just say, well, we just don't make it. I mean, we all have it, but we're not going to make, no, it's gone. So that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
That it would have to be purified.
Then I wonder after Passover was done and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where did they get their yeast to make their bread that rised?
Yeah.
You know, so
I don't know. They had a way of
I know. Knocking on the Egyptians' doors. Yeah, I don't know.
Ultimately, yeast and blood are two things that thicken things or that bring life to something. Mm-hmm. So blood brings life to a body, and yeast brings life to bread. Mm-hmm. It is a living thing, and they recognize this, even being where they are many, many years ago. They recognize that yeast is a thing that grows. They can take a piece off of that bread and they can put it with other bread, and that yeast will reproduce, and they'll have. So they've recognized all this. They know this. And so these are things that there's life in. And God is saying, don't eat those during this time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the other significant thing about the Passover that I really like is not only the symbolism of the food, which is cool. You know, when we think about Thanksgiving, that's what we often, think about. We think about, man, what are the food, the dishes, our traditions? But part of the celebration was to slow down and tell the story again.
Right.
You went back, and it was for every generation to hear again, be reminded of this thing that God did that radically changed everything. Like every day we're just living life. How are we able to even live this life? Because of this thing God did.
Yeah.
All the way back then. And I love that aspect of what the Passover, it's a piece we often forget about. We talk a lot about the symbolism of the food, but the storytelling. And every year we're going to tell that same story again. Doesn't matter how old it is. We're going to be reminded of the great thing that God did. And I like Jesus, the way and later on in chapter 12, God comes back and he says, I want you to observe this because I want you to keep remembering what I did.
Yes.
Observe this, not because it's good. Observe this so that you remember the work I did. Yeah. I read recently, I was thinking about the festivals and how ultimately all these festivals are for the people, but about God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For us to celebrate, but to bring us back to remembering it's about God.
And for that same purpose.
Yeah.
Every single one.
That's right.
Has the storytelling aspect of giving thanks to God.
Yeah.
So that idea of Thanksgiving tied to a festival occurs 106 times in the Bible. 106 times. Thanksgiving and feasts and festivals are tied together in various verses and passages.
God knew how to party.
He did know
with
how to
his
party.
people.
Yes.
It's something I think we miss
Right.
in the Old Testament, the beauty of how much God's like, let's have fun together and celebrate.
And I see a good father because I think of our grandkids running up and they want you to read the same story over and over and over again. And that God tells us the same story or told them the same good story over and over again. So I even see a picture of a good father in him.
That's good.
So, but they didn't always read the story over and over and over again. So they celebrated one. We know a year after they were out of Israel, they celebrated one.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure we hear about Passover for a while.
We don't.
Help me understand that. That seems like some disobedient children. So
Well, you would think it was, but it's really not.
Okay.
So they celebrate that first Passover, and then of course they leave Egypt then the next day, and then they celebrate it the next year when they're on their way to the Promised Land, and then they don't celebrate it for 40 years.
because they're wandering around in the desert.
They're wandering in the desert. So part of that is they're undergoing discipline and punishment.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they're grounded. And when you're grounded, you don't get to go to the party.
You don't get to play with your friends. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is a celebration, this is a wonder, and this is incredible. It's not that they're not telling the story. They're still telling the story. That's a permanent command that God gives to Moses. This is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Remember the story. Tell the story. Write it on the door frames of your houses, just like you put the blood on the door frames of your houses. Put the story, my words on the door, and write it on your hearts and pass it along to your children. So there's symbolism all through that. So they're telling the story, but they don't get to celebrate the Passover because they're naughty. And you don't get nice things when you get coal in your stocking. I guess we're almost in the season. So you get coal in your stocking when you're naughty. So that's what's going on. And they're not celebrating that, but they do then celebrate when they enter the promised land.
Okay.
And that's a pattern, in a sense, we see for Israel throughout history of the Old Testament, is how many times we look at when Israel's realizing their sin, the nation realizes their sin. One of the first things that happens is, let's bring back the Passover. Let's bring back the celebration. We're gonna set ourselves apart. We're gonna get back to being the people God's called us to do, and we're gonna start with this memory, the storytelling, and the sacredness of the party, the sacredness of the celebration, to remind us of what God did. Reminds us we've fallen away from that, but he's bringing us back to that in a similar way that he redeemed us the first time. So
we're seeing it as they enter the promised land. So my next question to you guys is, did Passover change over time?
It did. It did change. And that was, it changed in okay ways. So just like our traditions tend to change a little bit over time,
I'm better at cooking a turkey than I was when we first were married. So.
So that's part of it. But also you added kids.
Right.
They came up with their own traditions. So it probably was not your choice to watch Die Hard at Christmas time every year.
No, it was not my choice to do
But your kids do that, so they've added a tradition.
And they love Aunt Amy's Jell-O. There's a lot of things they demand. Yes.
Right. And this is what happens to the Passover. So what we see, again, they combine this, the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover kind of get combined into one. By the time of Jesus, there's some other things on the table other than just what was prescribed for them. So Jesus has wine on the table. God doesn't say anything specifically about wine. There's things that they're dipping sauces or something that they're dipping in. We see when Jesus is celebrating the Passover, we don't see any indication of that. These things take on their own life and in hopefully the best possible ways. But what the other things that get added, that Jesus, we see at the time of Jesus, he adds the singing of hymns. So there's music that gets added to this. That's not in the original Passover. And the first Passover, they don't tell the story of God's goodness because they don't have it yet. So that's the thing that goes in the next year, and that's the thing that gets carried over. But every year you're telling more of the story. And so by the time they get to Jesus, can you imagine what the story was? It was like, we set free from Egypt, and they tell the story of wandering and the story of the new kingdom and David and all this stuff. And then there's
Babylon.
Then there's Babylon. Then there's another 400 years of intertestamental stuff. And then now we're under occupation. And so maybe one day we'll be free. Now they're looking ahead to prophets. And so the story changes as they go too. And the reminders of them is one's initially it was the reminder of this cool thing God did. And as they're in these other occupations and in these terribles, it becomes also a prayer. Yeah. God, will you do this again? Please, it's a reminder how you can still celebrate God's goodness when things don't feel good. And you can still be thankful for what God has done as a way of also saying, and God, I need you to do this again. Yeah. Like we don't put sad and thankfulness together at the same time. It's like, I'm not even thankful for, I'm going to skip Thanksgiving, type of thing. And that's one thing they tended to do. And you even see this if you read some of the stories of how people celebrated Passover even during World War II,
when the Jews were in the middle of some terrible things, and the way they even connected the need for deliverance, even in that time, under what they were experiencing during the Holocaust, and how it became a prayer for them, even during that, is, I think, a lesson for us when we come into things like this for ourselves, like around Thanksgiving.
Because it really is more than just a looking back. There is an element of looking forward that is important for us too.
There is, and until the Lord comes again and do that. So, now when Jews are together and they celebrate, particularly the Passover, they say together at the end, next year in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Because that is the hope, and that the kingdom that is to come will be brought to bear. The biggest change, of course, is when Jesus celebrates the Passover, is he imbues it with new meaning. This is my body, this is my blood. Eat and drink. So that's where the big change comes from, and that's what we get to celebrate together, pretty consistently as a church. And we're going to celebrate on Sunday together. That a new infusion of meaning for the Passover meal.
It's very fun because I think, especially as we've done this series and the flyover verses, to take these verses and to see how they really do affect and give dimension to what God is asking us to do right now through baptism and communion. So thanks. Thank you. And thank you guys for joining us. Have a great week. Bye-bye.